The Alabaster Almanac, Volume 2, Chapter 1. The Woman Who Remembered the Wrong Life. Louisiana mornings never truly arrived. They simply sweated into existence. The daylight over Bayou Sainte-Mère seeped through moss and cypress limbs, as though the sun itself had grown reluctant to participate. Humidity already floated over the parking lot of St. Bernadette Behavioral Health Center in slow, translucent sheets. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a mockingbird attempted 3 different songs before apparently deciding none of them expressed its disappointment with the universe. Inside Ward C, someone was arguing with a vending machine about the Book of Revelation. Nobody intervened. It had been Tuesday for almost an hour. Dorothea Dupree opened one eye. "Johnny?" Nothing answered. That was peculiar. Janet answered everything. Sometimes twice. Dorothea slowly sat upright, every joint in her body complaining with the familiar, dependable honesty of a woman in her 60s. She scratched absent-mindedly at her hair, looked around the room, and frowned. This was not the nursery. She distinctly remembered there being balloons. She remembered arguing because Janet had insisted the baby needed a crib, carved entirely from petrified mushrooms. She remembered explaining very patiently that children should not sleep inside cursed furniture until they were at least in kindergarten. The argument had lasted almost 3 hours. Gumbo had refereed. Youngblood had somehow made it worse. Chaos had painted one wall lavender because evil infants deserve soothing colors. Sean had cried. Cora had baked a cake shaped like Louisiana. Professor Voss had spent an afternoon explaining why the Antichrist's cousin represented an entirely different theological problem than the Antichrist himself. It had all made perfect sense. Absolute perfect sense. Dorothea looked down. Hospital pajamas. Blue socks. An identification bracelet. Well... She rubbed her chin. That's inconvenient. The door opened. A nurse entered carrying a plastic cup of pills. She looked pleasantly exhausted. The sort of woman who had long ago accepted that human beings were fundamentally ridiculous creatures and found life easier afterward. "Morning, Mrs. Dupree." Dorothea narrowed her eyes. "You're not Janet." "No." "You're considerably less slimy." "I've heard that before." "I doubt you have. I work psychiatry." "Fair enough." The nurse handed her the medication. Dorothea accepted it automatically. "What day is it?" "Tuesday." "No." Dorothea frowned. "I mean, what chapter?" The nurse smiled. "I wondered how long it'd take." "Take for what?" "For you to ask." Dorothea sighed. "I've asked stranger questions." "You certainly have. I don't suppose somebody finally explained where Scott came from." "No." "Or why Ralph knows so much about municipal tax law." "No." "Or whether Janet actually gave birth?" The nurse blinked. "Gave birth to what?" Dorothea stared. "The Antichrist's cousin." Silence. The nurse slowly lowered the clipboard. "I'm sorry." "MMHM?" "The what?" "The Antichrist's cousin." Another pause. "And I..." Dorothea hesitated. "Was apparently the father." The nurse quietly pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed. "I think I'd better sit down." "I thought so too." For almost 20 minutes, Dorothea recounted the strangest months she had ever supposedly lived. Janet's impossible pregnancy. Her own complete conviction that she was somehow the child's father despite every biological obstacle imaginable. Arguments over baby names, rosary beads, the convent, the woods, the pond, a doctor who accidentally diagnosed a scarecrow with seasonal allergies, someone insisting Satan had developed bursitis. Everything flowed with crystalline clarity. Every detail fit perfectly. Every memory possessed texture, emotion. Wait. When she finally finished, the nurse was staring. Mrs. Dupree. Yes?
You've been here 4 days.
Dorothea laughed.
No.
You were admitted Saturday morning.
No.
I promise.
No.
She smiled kindly. I appreciate the effort. The nurse gently shook her head. You've never left this building. The smile faded. Slowly.
No. I'm afraid so.
But... Dorothea searched desperately through the impossible architecture of memory. The nursery, Janet, the baby, the woods, chaos laughing, Gumbo humming. Every bit of it felt real. That can be. I'm sorry.
No.
It can. No. Her voice became very small.
I held that baby.
The nurse's expression softened.
I believe you think you did.
I remember the weight.
I know.
I remember the smell.
I know.
I remember. Her throat tightened. Loving that child. The room became impossibly quiet. The nurse rested a hand gently on Dorothea's shoulder. The heart remembers feelings even when the mind invents the story. Neither woman spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Dorothea whispered, Then why am I here? The nurse looked toward the door. I'll let Dr. Eddings explain. Dr. Eddings looked exactly like a man who alphabetized his spices. Everything about him suggested competent tidiness. His shoes were polished, his beard trimmed, his tie aggressively sensible. He opened the chart. Dorota Dupree. Doctor. How are we? I've apparently misplaced several months. It would seem so. Dorothea folded her arms. I'd like them back. So would I. She frowned. What? He closed the chart. Mrs. Dupree. I don't like that tone. Do you remember climbing onto the church? No. The roof?
No.
The bell tower?
No.
The steeple?
No.
He nodded. We expected as much. Dorothea waited. You climbed all the way to the top. She laughed.
I absolutely did not.
You did.
I have arthritis.
You still did. I dislike ladders. You still climbed.
I get winded putting Christmas decorations away.
You remained on top of the steeple for 3 hours. She stopped smiling. Naked? He nodded.
Oh, dear.
The Port Authority called. They did? The sheriff's office.
Oh.
The fire department.
Oh, no.
The bishop.
Oh, dear Lord.
The television station. Please stop. The local amateur birdwatching society. She blinked.
Why them?
You apologized individually to approximately 200 migrating birds. Dorothea buried her face in both hands. I would like to resign from existence. That request has been noted. Her voice echoed between her fingers. I've never even liked birds. By lunchtime, she had become convinced there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Not about the steeple. That much was apparently undeniable. About everything after. Because every time she reached for the memory, there was something else. Something enormous. Just beyond reach. She remembered standing atop the church. She remembered wind. She remembered looking, not at the town, beyond it, far beyond it, as though something impossible had opened over Bayou Saint-Mere. Then, nothing, a blank wall. Her pulse quickened. No matter how hard she tried, the memory simply wasn't there. Someone had locked a door inside her own mind. Rain arrived just after 3 o'clock. Louisiana rain did not fall. It negotiated. Heavy drops struck the hospital windows with slow, deliberate rhythm. Dorothea watched them race one another down the glass. Someone knocked softly. She didn't turn around. Come in. Footsteps. Familiar footsteps. Measured. Confident. Clotilde. Dorothea smiled before she even looked. You always walk like you're late to correct somebody. I usually am. They embraced for a long time. Longer than either expected. Dorothea pulled away first. You look awful. So do you. Excellent. I brought coffee. I knew God hadn't abandoned me. Clotilde produced 2 paper cups from a bag. Real coffee, not hospital coffee. Dorothea nearly cried. Marry me. I think Gumbo would object. He'll adjust. For several minutes they talked about absolutely nothing. Hospital food. Chaos. Baby Germaine. Sean accidentally locking himself out of the music shop twice in one afternoon. Janet allegedly attempting to baptize a turtle. Normal things. Comfortable things. Eventually Dorothea asked the question. So? Clotilde nodded. I know. What happened? Silence. What did I do? More silence. I've asked 3 nurses. I know. The doctor. I know. Nobody will tell me. I know. Dorothea leaned closer. Did I hurt someone? No. Break anything? No. Say something hateful? No. Then why won't anybody answer me? Clotilde looked out at the rain. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried. Because none of us know whether remembering would heal you, she swallowed, or break every one of us all over again. Dorothea stared. What does that mean? Clotilde didn't answer. For the first time in over 20 years, Dorothea realized her oldest friend was genuinely afraid, not frightened. Afraid. There was a difference. Clotilde had faced cult leaders, ghosts, miracles, death, things with too many teeth, things with not enough dimensions. Dorothea had never once seen fear remain on her face this long. Something had happened. Something nobody in Bayou Saint-Mere knew how to name. And whatever it was, everyone had decided Dorothea herself could never be allowed to remember it. Outside, somewhere beyond the rain, the bell of the old church rang once. Clotilde flinched. Only slightly. But Dorothea noticed. And that frightened her far more than anything she could no longer remember. Chapter 2. Home is a place that pretends nothing happened. 3 mornings later, Bayou Saint-Mere smelled like wet earth, chicory coffee, and the lingering optimism of people who had survived one more humid Louisiana summer without strangling each other. A mockingbird perched on the convent gate whistled the first 8 notes of a disco tune before abruptly switching to a funeral hymn, apparently deciding both belonged together. Nobody questioned it. The convent had stopped questioning birds years ago. Dorothea Dupree stepped out of Clotilde's car and stood perfectly still. Home. The pale yellow house sat exactly where memory insisted it should, tucked beneath sprawling oaks whose branches looked like elderly women gossiping over a fence. Beyond them the church stood in quiet dignity, its bell tower reaching into a pale blue morning sky with complete innocence. Dorothea looked at it. The bell tower looked back by refusing to look back at all. A peculiar shiver ran through her. "I don't remember hating that thing," she murmured. Clotilde quietly picked up her overnight bag. "You don't." "I think I might. I know." Before Dorothea could answer, the front door burst open. Gumbo Dupree shuffled outside much faster than any 88-year-old man had business moving. "Dorothea." She smiled so broadly her cheeks hurt. "Gumbo." They met halfway across the yard. His embrace was warm, gentle, far weaker than she remembered. She felt every rib beneath his shirt. When they stepped apart, she studied him carefully. His shoulders had narrowed. His hands trembled faintly. Even his famous compass needle wrists seemed slower now, twitching only once before becoming still again. "You've lost weight." "So have you." "You first." "Ladies first." She laughed. "You look terrible." "I've been practicing." "You've gotten good." "I've always been an overachiever." They hugged again. Longer this time. Long enough for Dorothea to realize he smelled exactly like home coffee, machine oil, cedar shavings, and the faint sweetness of tea cake cooling somewhere inside the kitchen. "I missed you," Gumbo whispered. "I know." Inside, everything remained gloriously familiar. The kitchen windows overlooked the bonsai garden. The old broom still leaned beside the pantry in precisely the same place Dorothea herself had insisted upon years earlier. The talking kidney stone rested in its leather pouch on the windowsill, saying nothing for once. Even the old tape recorder Gumbo used to dictate odd dreams still sat beside the sugar bowl. Dorothea ran a hand across the countertop. "I was afraid it'd all feel different." Gumbo smiled. It was waiting. Janet suddenly oozed through the open back door carrying what appeared to be half of a mammoth femur. "Found breakfast?" Everyone stared. Professor Voss, arriving only moments behind her, sighed. "Janet." "What?" "That's a petrified tree root." Janet examined it. "Really?" "Yes." "Can I still season it?" "No." "Well, that's tricky." She tossed it into the yard. A squirrel immediately claimed it. Nobody objected. Breakfast unfolded slowly. Fresh biscuits, eggs, bacon, homemade preserves, strong coffee. Conversation wandered from chaos, accidentally throwing a shovel into the orchard, with his telekinesis to Sean's increasingly unsuccessful attempts to grow tomatoes. "I've decided," Sean announced, "that gardening actively dislikes me." "The tomatoes are body-minded," Professor Voss replied thoughtfully. "You're so minded." Occasionally, plants find that philosophically incompatible. Sean blinked. I have absolutely no idea what that means. Neither do I, Voss admitted pleasantly. It simply sounded correct. Ralph the parrot snorted from the curtain rod. That's how most committees are formed. Laughter finally loosened the room. Dorothea hadn't heard this sound in days. She drank it in. Then, almost without thinking, she looked toward the church through the kitchen window. So... Instantly the room quieted. About the steeple. Silence. Chaos suddenly became fascinated with buttering toast. Sean inspected his coffee. Professor Voss cleaned already spotless glasses. Janet pretended to study the ceiling. Even Ralph declined to speak. Dorothea slowly lowered her fork. What? Nobody answered. She looked at Gumbo. Gumbo. His eyes were kind. Painfully kind. Honey?
No.
She leaned forward.
Everybody does this. I know.
The doctor?
Yes.
Clotilde.
Yes?
Now all of you. She pointed toward the church. What happened? Nobody spoke. Finally, Chaos cleared his throat.
It's...
He stopped. Professor Voss quietly finished for him. Complicated. I know it's complicated. No, Voss replied softly. You don't. Another silence settled over the table, this one heavier. Gumbo finally rested his weathered hand over hers. It isn't the church.
Then what is it?
The tunnel. Dorothea frowned. Dunno? Every eye in the room met someone else's. Nobody wanted to be first. Professor Voss reluctantly spoke. During your hospitalization, he chose every word with extraordinary care. We confirmed the existence of an underground passage beneath the convent. Dorothea blinked. There's a... tunnel? Gumbo nodded. It branches. To where? Several places. The museum. The malt shop. The abandoned chapel. The levee. The old blind school. And... He hesitated. Beneath the church. Dorothea looked from face to face. I've lived here for 20 years. We know. And nobody noticed? We noticed walls. Professor Voss smiled weakly. We failed to notice what was between them. Dorothea shook her head slowly. What does that have to do with me? Nobody answered. Again. Later that afternoon, Chaos walked beside Youngblood through the orchard. Neither spoke for nearly 5 minutes. Finally, Chaos sighed. I still hear it. Youngblood nodded. So do I. I don't know whether it's memory or whether it's still happening. Chaos looked toward the distant church. When I went into the tunnel, he stopped. His voice became quieter. I heard somebody talking directly inside my thoughts. Youngblood didn't look surprised. I wasn't alone. No. It knew my name. Yes. It knew things nobody should know. Youngblood's expression darkened. It knew all of ours. Chaos kicked a pine cone off the path. I haven't slept right since. I know. Far beneath their feet, hidden under layers of clay, limestone, forgotten brick, and roots older than the convent itself, something shifted, not loudly, not violently. Like an old lock, quietly discovering it had never actually been locked. Somewhere in the darkness, a tiny metallic sound echoed. throw. Nobody heard it, except perhaps something that had been listening since August of some forgotten century. That evening Dorothea found Gumbo sitting alone on the porch. The sunset painted a faint halo around his silver hair. He looked tired, older than he had only a week before. She quietly sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, she rested her head against his shoulder.
I won't ask.
Thank you. But I will someday. I know. You'll tell me? When it's time. She looked toward the church again. Then toward the woods. Then toward the quiet earth separating them. You know...
What?
If there really is a tunnel underneath all of us. She smiled faintly. I suppose that explains why this town always feels like it's keeping secrets. Gumbo chuckled. The town ain't the one keeping them. The porch grew quiet. From somewhere across Bayou Saint-Mere came the distant sound of a car's broken tom-tom navigation system endlessly insisting. Recalculating, recalibrating, availability unavailable, make a legal U-turn. Ralph listened for a moment before muttering to himself, even machinery gets lost around here. For the first time since leaving the hospital, Dorothea laughed until tears came to her eyes. Neither she nor Gumbo noticed that, beneath the porch, the earth gave the smallest, almost imperceptible tremor as though someone, or something, had just begun walking through the hidden tunnel once more. Chapter 3. Beneath the Roots. Dorothea Dupree dreamed she was standing in the tunnel. She knew it was the tunnel before she ever looked down. The floor was cool beneath her bare feet, made not of dirt but of ancient stone polished by centuries of footsteps no history book had bothered to remember. The darkness ahead possessed a peculiar intelligence. It did not simply conceal things. It seemed to wait. A voice spoke directly into her thoughts. Not a man's, not a woman's, not even a voice exactly. More like a memory that had forgotten whose it was. You climbed because you remembered. The words echoed without sound. Dorothea tried to answer. What did I remember? A pause. You were never meant to remember. Remember what? The darkness shifted. Far ahead she saw the faint outline of the church bell tower. It wasn't above ground. It was beneath it, upside down, as though the church had roots instead of a foundation. The strange voice returned. You belong to both directions. What does that mean? No answer. Only one last thought. Find the first crossroads before they do. She awoke sitting bolt upright. Her heart hammered against her ribs. For one magnificent second she knew exactly what every word had meant. Then, like smoke carried away by a breeze, the meaning vanished. No. She grabbed at the memory. It dissolved. All that remained was one certainty.
The tunnel.
By 8 o'clock she was fully dressed. Chaos met her outside near the orchard. You don't look like somebody going for a morning walk. I'm not. I knew it. I'm going underground. Chaos sighed. So am I. You don't have to. I know. I may be wrong. I know. I may have dreamed the whole thing. I know. I'm still coming. Gumbo was waiting near the old storage shed. He had already guessed. Old age had slowed his body. It had done very little to diminish his intuition.
No.
Dorothea stopped.
No. No.
I'm just looking.
No.
I'll be careful.
No.
Chaos quietly examined his shoes. Gumbo's compass needle wrists twitched twice. That almost never happened anymore. His expression darkened. Honey, I have to.
No.
I think something called me.
I know.
And? I don't trust things that call. Before Dorothea could answer, Ralph swooped down onto the shed roof. For once I'm with Grandpa Gumbo, he shouted. Nothing good ever begins with I heard mysterious voices underground. That's how you wind up eating cold hamburger in a haunted drainage ditch while questioning every decision that brought you there. Janet slowly emerged from the orchard, carrying 3 apples. I'd eat a haunted hamburger. Ralph glared.
You are not.
I rarely do.
Professor Voss came running from the museum path, completely out of breath. He bent over. I've just spoken. Another breath. To the moose. Nobody asked which one. There was only one. The talking moose head? Chaos asked.
Yes.
What did it say? Professor Voss became unusually serious. It said something I cannot explain. Everyone waited.
It said...
He swallowed. The tunnel is neither here nor there. It is where thoughts go before they become memories. Silence. It also said, Voss looked visibly disturbed, do not trust the shortest path. The maze studies your mind before it lets you study the maze. Dorothea felt the dream rushing back. Not the details, only the feeling. A deep, unsettling certainty. The entrance lay beneath a loose section of stone floor inside the abandoned storage building. It descended by worn brick steps. Cold air drifted upward. Black as a moonless river. Older than the convent. Older than the town. Chaos switched on a lantern. The light barely reached 10 feet. Beyond that, darkness simply swallowed it. It feels, Chaos whispered, wrong. It does, Dorothea agreed. It feels like standing at the breaking point of a thought. Professor Voss looked around carefully. The architecture doesn't make sense. It doesn't?
No.
He held up a notebook. I mapped this yesterday. He frowned. It should continue east. The passage curved west. Nobody had turned. Nobody could explain it. The deeper they walked, the stranger everything became. Their footsteps sounded delayed, as though someone behind them was politely repeating each one. The walls seemed to breathe, not literally, mentally. Dorothea found herself remembering things she'd never intended to remember. Young love, the smell of her mother's kitchen. The first time she'd met Gumbo. The first time she'd ever felt truly free as a bird. Then, an entirely foreign memory. Someone celebrating Kwanzaa. She had never celebrated Kwanzaa. Another memory. A man of the cloth quietly weeping over a letter of resignation. Not her memory. Someone else's. Chaos stopped walking. Dorothée. What? I keep remembering things. So do I. Things I've never lived. Professor Voss looked almost over the moon at the discovery, despite his obvious fear.
The tunnel isn't reading our thoughts.
What then? I believe... He hesitated. It's letting us read fragments of everyone else's. Somewhere ahead, a whisper, not heard, felt. Dorothea. She froze. Chaos grabbed her arm. Don't. I know that voice. No, you don't. I almost do. The lantern flickered. For an instant, the darkness ahead seemed crimson and clover all at once, colors occupying the same impossible space. Then it vanished. Back above ground, Ralph paced furiously along the porch railing. I hate this. I hate every feather of this. This is exactly how respectable people wind up in suspicious white van stories. Janet looked puzzled. What's a suspicious white van? A poor man's version of destiny. I don't understand. Neither do I. Deep underground, the passages multiplied. 1 became 3. 3 became 7. Every intersection looked identical. Yet every direction felt emotionally different. One corridor felt engulfed with rage. Another carried a strange feeling of mercy killing not violence, but the painful ending of something ancient. A third felt as peaceful as a spiritual retreat. Chaos shivered. I don't like this. Neither do I. Dorothea stepped toward the left-hand passage. No. Chaos caught her sleeve. Why this one? Then don't. She looked at him. I think it knows me. Chaos's face turned pale. I think that's exactly the problem. Without warning, every lantern went dark. Absolute blackness. Not ordinary darkness. The kind that erased distance itself. Chaos could no longer tell whether his eyes were open. Somewhere ahead, footsteps, not theirs. Then a psychic impression slammed into both of them at once. Not words, images, a crude map, anekis, a single overwhelming certainty. X marks the spot. Then, nothing. The lantern sputtered back to life. Dorothea was gone. Dottie! Chaos shouted until his throat hurt. No answer. Only the endless maze. His own breathing. He ran. He stumbled. He nearly trampled Professor Voss trying to find the exit. The tunnels seemed to rearrange themselves behind him. Every turn looked unfamiliar. Every shadow watched. When he finally burst into daylight, he was gasping. Gumbo! Everyone turned. Chaos could barely force the words out. She's gone. The yard became silent. Gumbo didn't ask how. He already knew enough. He picked up the brightest lantern they owned. Clothild's car turned into the convent drive just as he reached the entrance. She stepped out. One look at Chaos told her everything. No. Gumbo met her eyes. I'm bringing her home. Without another word, the old man descended into the darkness, lantern in one hand, the other resting against the cold stone wall as though greeting an old enemy. The light grew small, then smaller still, until only a tiny golden point remained. Finally, from somewhere impossibly deep beneath Bayou Sainte-Mere, they heard Gumbo's voice, soft, filled with astonishment. Oh, it can't be. The lantern vanished. Silence answered. And for the first time since anyone had discovered the tunnels, every person standing above them understood the same terrible truth. Whatever lived beneath the convent had just claimed 2 of the people who knew Bayou Sainte-Mere better than anyone alive. No one waiting above was any the wiser as to why. Chapter 4. The nun who could not come down. Nobody slept. The pale yellow house remained lit until nearly dawn, its windows glowing softly through the moss-draped oaks like tired eyes refusing to close. Coffee had become less of a beverage and more of a survival strategy. Gumbo had not returned. Dorothea had not returned. Chaos had come back from the tunnel with a face 20 years older than the one he'd worn going in. Outside, cicadas screamed into the darkness with such determination that Ralph finally shouted through an open window, "If one more bug starts singing like it's auditioning for the apocalypse, I'm filing a formal noise complaint with Evolution." Nobody laughed. Not because it wasn't funny. Because everyone was too frightened to remember how. Morning arrived reluctantly. Professor Voss stood in the museum beneath the talking moose head, notebook open, waiting. The mounted moose stared straight ahead for almost 10 full minutes. Then its jaw creaked. "Professor." "Good morning." "It isn't." "I suspected as much." The moose said a remarkable sound considering it possessed neither lungs nor any obvious reason to sigh. "The tunnel is collaborating." Professor Voss's pencil stopped. "With what?" "Itself." "I don't understand." "You aren't supposed to." The room fell silent. Finally the moose spoke again. "It has begun recognizing minds instead of footsteps." Professor Voss frowned. "Recognizing?" "It has acquired its own facial recognition software." "Facial recognition?" "It no longer needs faces." The professor stared blankly. The moose continued. "It recognizes grief." A pause. "It recognizes guilt." Another pause. "And now?" Its glass eyes seemed almost alive. "It recognizes family." The professor's stomach dropped. Across town, near the abandoned gas station on 11th Street, Sheriff Delacroix stood with 3 deputies staring into the drainage ditch. Nothing remarkable should have been there. Instead, there were footprints. Hundreds of them. All leading toward town. None leading away. The prints were made in deep red clay despite the nearest red clay bank being almost 5 miles away. The sheriff removed his hat. "Holy mackerel," one deputy whispered. "Holy crap," the third simply muttered. "Holy—" He stopped. "I'm not finishing that sentence." The sheriff looked toward the convent. "Call Professor Voss." Chaos had barely finished another cup of coffee when Clotilde entered the kitchen. She looked composed. Too composed. Everyone who knew her recognized the danger immediately. When Clotilde became perfectly calm, something enormous was happening inside her. Chaos quietly asked, "Any news?" She shook her head. "Nothing."
Nothing at all.
"Nothing that makes sense." Janet slurped oatmeal. "I've never trusted things that make sense." "You don't trust oatmeal." "Oatmeal started it." "No idea what that means," Sean admitted. "Neither does oatmeal." Then it happened. Clotilde stopped speaking. Her coffee cup gently rose from the table. Chaos looked up. "So—" Nobody had time to finish the sentence. Clotilde's shoes left the floor. "Exactly 1 inch," she noticed. 2 inches. "Oh, dear." 6 inches. Professor Voss quietly closed his notebook. "Everyone." 1 foot. 2. 3. Chaos stood. "Clotilde?" "I don't appear to be—" She drifted upward another 4 feet. Finished. Janet applauded politely. "I've always wanted to know what that looked like." Janet... What? By the time everyone reached the convent courtyard, Clotilde had risen above the roof. 20 feet. 30. 50. The wind caught her habit, which fluttered dramatically enough that Ralph remarked, "If this keeps up, the holy rollers are going to start charging admission." Nobody appreciated the joke. Chaos cupped his hands.
Can you come down?
No.
Can you move?
No.
Are you alright?
No! She continued, drifting upward. 2nd story. 3rd story. Until she hovered nearly 3 stories above the convent grounds, perfectly still. The expression on her face had changed. She wasn't frightened anymore. She was listening. Listening to something nobody else could hear. Then Chaos heard it. Not with his ears. Inside his thoughts. Look up. He did. Clotilde wasn't looking down at them. She was staring far beyond Bayou Saint-Mere, toward the horizon, toward something invisible. A psychic impression brushed his mind. Not words, just emotion, urgency. Then one clear sentence. She's seeing what the tunnel sees. Chaos staggered backward. A tiny whinny interrupted the panic. Anna, the little horse, trotted calmly from the orchard. Barely a foot tall. Sparkling. Her coat shimmered between white and faint emerald green as healing vibrations danced around her tiny hooves. She stopped directly beneath Clotilde, looked upward, then quietly pawed the ground. Once, twice, 3 times. Chaos suddenly understood.
I know.
Nobody had spoken. Yet somehow he knew. He gently rested one hand upon Anna's neck. Immediately warmth flooded through him. Not power. Clarity. He looked upward again.
Clotilde?
His voice carried across the courtyard. Stop listening. She didn't respond. You aren't supposed to hear all of it. Still nothing. Chaos closed his eyes. He thought, not spoke. Come home. Far above. Clotilde blinked. Then, for the first time in nearly 15 minutes, she looked down. The invisible force weakened. Very slowly, she descended, not falling, returning. As her feet touched the grass, she collapsed into Chaos's arms. She whispered only 4 words.
It's all of us.
Professor Voss arrived breathless from town.
The sheriff called.
Chaos looked up.
What now?
There are footprints. So, they all lead toward the convent. People walk.
Cows.
The professor's voice became almost inaudible. There are hundreds.
And?
Every footprint is a different shoe size. Chaos frowned. So, they're all left feet. Silence. Even Ralph stopped talking. By noon, the convent resembled a command center. Maps covered the kitchen table. The old tape recorder played Gumbo's previous notes over and over. Professor Voss had pinned photographs to the wall. The sheriff arrived carrying evidence from the crime lab. Sean quietly unpacked sandwiches. Janet insisted the situation required a cafeteria-style buffet because existential dread burns calories. Nobody argued. Smoked meat appeared. Fresh bread. Cornbread. Bowls of coriander-seasoned vegetables supplied by the convent's master gardener. Even in catastrophe, people still had to eat. Ralph landed beside the buffet. I've seen God's wrath with fewer side dishes. The sheriff spread photographs across the table. Chaos immediately noticed something else. What are these? Security stills. From where? The old Cosmopolitan Hotel. There hasn't been anyone staying there. There still isn't. The sheriff swallowed. The cameras recorded movement. What kind of movement? He hesitated. Nobody. What? The software kept identifying faces. Chaos looked carefully. The hallway was empty, yet little digital boxes floated in mid-air, labeling invisible people. Recognition complete. Recognition complete. Recognition complete. Professor Voss quietly sat down. The tunnel. The sheriff nodded.
I think so.
That afternoon, a nervous volunteer from a nearby spiritual retreat arrived to report another strange occurrence. I know this sounds ridiculous. Everyone stared expectantly. Our country rode out by Miller's Crossing. Yes? Every mile marker now points toward the convent. Professor Voss rubbed his temples. The geography is changing.
No.
The talking kidney stone unexpectedly interrupted from the windowsill. The directions are. Nobody questioned the kidney stone. Evening settled over Bayou Sa, mere beneath clouds, the peculiar color of teal-green fading into bruised violet. Chaos stood alone on the porch. He remembered Dorothea. Gumbo. The tunnel. Clotilde floating impossibly high above the earth. The invisible mines. The footprints. The cameras. Nothing connected. Yet somehow everything belonged together. Behind him, Ralph quietly muttered, You know, yesterday I thought the strangest thing I'd ever see would be a Geo Metro towing wicker furniture through downtown, while a man with a concealed carry license argued with a nutritionist over whether barbecue sauce belonged on smoked meat. Today that story doesn't even crack the top 10. For the first time all day, Chaos laughed. It lasted only a moment, because beyond the trees, deep beneath the convent, something answered with a sound that was almost laughter. Almost. And somewhere far below the earth, in a darkness no lantern had yet reached, Dorothea Dupree opened her eyes. Chapter 5. The Direction the Earth Forgot. The first thing anyone noticed was that Clotilde was missing. The second thing they noticed was that the rocking chair on the convent porch was still moving. Not gently. Not from the wind. As though someone had risen from it only moments before. Chaos called her name twice. Sean searched the kitchen. Janet looked inside the pantry, just in case she'd become soup. Professor Voss declined to ask why that had seemed like a reasonable possibility. Then Ralph landed hard on the porch railing, every feather standing on end. I just saw a nun fly over the orchard. Everyone stopped. You what? Chaos. I said, Ralph replied with complete seriousness, I just saw a nun fly over the orchard. I realize that's an unusual sentence, but it's been an unusual week. By the time they reached the field behind the convent, Clotilde had risen nearly 6 stories into the morning sky. Unlike the day before, she wasn't simply hovering. She was drifting. Southwest. Slowly at first. Then faster. Her habit billowed behind her like a weather flag. She made no effort to resist. See Loteld, Chaos shouted. She didn't answer. Her eyes were open. She was staring at something no one else could see. Then a gust from an approaching storm front caught her. She was carried over the trees, across the marsh, and disappeared into the morning haze. The silence she left behind was worse than any scream. She was found shortly after noon, not in Bayou Sainte-Mere, but in the neighboring town of Bel Ruisseau, sitting cross-legged atop the faded marquee of a shuttered movie theater. She had somehow traveled nearly 14 miles. The volunteer firefighters coaxed her down with remarkable patience. She recognized no one. Not Chaos. Not Sean. Not even Gumbo's photograph. When they asked her name, she whispered, "The tunnel has forgotten how to blink." When they asked where she lived, she replied, "Providence has tangled hair." Then she laughed, then cried, then quietly began counting backward in a language no one present recognized. The attending physician wrote only one sentence in his notebook. Severely mentally disturbed. Professor Voss crossed it out. Beneath it, he wrote instead, "Overexposed to something no human mind was built to witness." Back at the convent, Youngblood wandered alone through the garden. He had stopped trying to understand coincidence years ago. The bird feeder beside the old pear tree had always attracted cardinals. This afternoon, it attracted none. Instead, every seed slowly slid from the feeder, one by one, falling to the ground. Not randomly. They arranged themselves into letters. Youngblood watched in silence. Rosary beads hanging from a nearby branch suddenly snapped. They spilled onto the stone path, bouncing, breaking onto the floor of the old veranda, then rolling through the open doorway into the garden. Each bead came to rest against the seeds. The message became clearer. He whispered it aloud. "The front of the line is below the waterfront." The words chilled him. Then more seeds shifted. "Do not mistake amplification for magnification." Youngblood frowned. "I think it means magnification." The feeder tipped over. Every remaining seed spilled out at once. A final sentence appeared. "The $1 million man was never the richest." Youngblood looked around. That seems oddly specific. The wind erased the message. Late that afternoon, Sean took the long path toward the old shore front, hoping a walk might untangle his thoughts. Instead, he heard grunting. Wild pigs, 6 of them. Large, scarred, silent. They emerged from the brush and formed a loose circle around him. Sean didn't move. Neither did they. Oddly, they didn't appear aggressive. They simply watched, as though waiting. One enormous boar stepped forward, dropped something at Sean's feet. Then the entire sounder turned and disappeared into the trees. Sean looked down. An old brass key, stamped with a single word. Storefront. The key fit only one lock in town. The back door of the abandoned malt shop. Chaos, Sean, Professor Voss, and Ralph entered together. Dust lay thick over everything. Old soda fountains, broken stools, a cracked menu board advertising milkshakes no one would ever order again. Behind the counter, nothing. Behind the kitchen, nothing. Until Sean opened the alley door. The narrow passage behind the malt shop smelled faintly of spilled coffee and rain. Near the brick wall lay a rusted tin box. Inside, a faded ledger, old receipts, several packages of blunt papers still wrapped in brittle cellophane, a half-empty bottle of hand sanitizer that looked decades too old to exist, wet wipes, A receipt with the words fronting the money scrawled across the back. And beneath everything, a map. Professor Voss unfolded it carefully. His face changed.
This... what?
Is the tunnel. Chaos leaned closer.
But...
It doesn't begin beneath the convent. Professor Voss nodded. It begins here. His finger rested on the malt shop, then traced a hidden passage, past the church, beneath the museum, toward places no modern survey had ever recorded. Near one corner, someone had written in fountain pen, "Teacher's pet entrance." Janet frowned. Teacher's pet? No idea, Voss admitted. But whoever drew this wanted that remembered. Ralph paced along the counter. This has implication written all over it. You mean implications, Sean corrected. I never use the plural unless I'm absolutely sure. Chaos folded the map. I'm going... Sean immediately objected.
No?
You saw what happened to Dorothea.
I know. Gumbo. I know. Clouded. I know.
So why? Chaos looked toward the hidden doorway beneath the cellar floor. Because somebody has to stop putting on a front. Nobody spoke. He was right. Fear had become another resident of the convent. Every conversation danced around it. Every meal. Every prayer. Every silence. The entrance beneath the malt shop felt different. Colder. The air carried the smell of old stone and river water. Chaos descended alone. Lantern in one hand. The map in the other. Above him, Sean waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, Sean called down.
Chaos.
No answer.
Can you hear me?
Nothing. Then, very faintly, a psychic whisper brushed Sean's mind. Not from Chaos. From somewhere much deeper. Confrontation requires castigation. Another whisper. Manipulation wears the kindest face. Then, silence. Sean waited. Another minute. Another 5. Finally, he climbed down 3 steps.
Chaos.
Nothing. The lantern glow that should have been visible below was gone. The tunnel had taken another traveler. Sean climbed back into the fading daylight, his face pale. Professor. Voss didn't have to ask. He already knew. The map trembled in his hands. Somewhere beneath Bayou Sainte-Mere, the maze had just claimed another of its visitors. And for the first time since the mystery began, the remaining friends were forced to confront a possibility none of them had dared speak aloud. The tunnel was no longer waiting for people to find it. It was choosing them. Chapter 6. The office behind the office. The malt shop had a different personality after closing. By day it smelled of vanilla syrup, grilled onions, fresh coffee, and teenagers trying much too hard to impress one another. By night, it became thoughtful. The old floorboards settled with tiny sighs. The chrome stools reflected only fragments of moonlight. Outside, the brick path running beneath the bridge toward the convent and the church glistened from an evening rain, the little stairways leading up to each building looking strangely theatrical, as though they expected someone important to arrive. Cora switched off the last dining room light. Another day, she sighed. Ralph, perched atop the antique cash register, fluffed his feathers. I've always said restaurants become philosophers after midnight. You've also said gravy is a religion. I stand by both statements. She smiled. You coming? In a minute. What for? I like to make sure the ketchup bottles aren't plotting. The little office behind the kitchen measured perhaps 9 feet by 10. A battered desk, old payroll books, an adding machine that still worked whenever it felt appreciated, a faded photograph of Gumbo and Dorothea smiling outside the church decades earlier. Cora counted receipts, balanced the register, locked the cash drawer. She reached for the light switch. Click. Nothing happened.
Wonderful.
The bulb hadn't burned out. The darkness simply remained. Then, a soft wooden creak. Behind the filing cabinet, a narrow wall panel slowly swung inward. Cold air drifted into the office. Cora frowned. I've worked here 26 years. Another creak.
There has never been a door there.
Somewhere below, someone whispered her name. Not aloud. Inside her thoughts. Mother? She froze. Not because the voice frightened her, because she knew it. Chaos. Miles away beneath the earth, Chaos stumbled through another impossible corridor. His lantern had long since surrendered. The tunnel no longer needed darkness. It carried its own. His breathing echoed strangely, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind. He rested one hand against the wall. Immediately another mind touched his.
Mama.
His own thought. But someone else heard it. Cora gasped. The office disappeared. Not physically. Mentally. For one impossible instant, she saw through Chaos's eyes. Ancient stone. Water trickling somewhere unseen. Symbols carved into walls older than language. A faint emerald glow far ahead. Then, gone. She grabbed the desk to steady herself. Holy... She stopped. Holy crap! Ralph poked his head into the office. You all right?
No.
I've had worse answers. The hidden passage waited. She should have closed the panel. She should have called Professor Voss. She should have gone home. Instead, she picked up an old lantern.
I'm just looking.
Ralph sighed dramatically. That's exactly what every horror story begins with. It's not a horror story. It is after somebody says, I'm just looking. The tunnel beneath the malt shop felt different from the convent entrance. Less ancient. More personal. As though this passage had been used by generations of ordinary people carrying ordinary secrets. The air smelled faintly of limestone, ivory soap, and old whiskey sour spilled decades ago. Cora walked slowly. Every few steps she pauses, not because she heard something, because she felt someone thinking. Chaos. The connection strengthened. Not words. Emotion. Fear. Determination. Love. Professor Voss had once joked that psychic gifts often ran in families. Everyone laughed. No one had realized he might have been serious. Farther ahead, the tunnel widened into a circular chamber. Its ceiling disappeared into darkness. Stone pillars surrounded the room like silent processional attendants. At the center, something stood. Not someone. Something. Tall. Motionless. Holding what looked remarkably like a stone scepter. Its face remained hidden. Not concealed. Simply impossible to remember. Every time Cora looked directly at it, she immediately forgot what she'd seen. The being regarded her without moving. Then, a thought entered her mind. You have always been collaborating.
I don't understand.
Blood remembers.
Chaos.
Blood remembers farther than love. Cora suddenly felt tears welling.
I want my son.
The being neither answered nor moved. Instead, another image entered her mind. Chaos. Alive. Walking. Searching. The vision vanished. Hope replaced terror. Back above ground, Professor Voss paced the convent porch.
I don't like this.
Sean nodded. You've said that 43 times.
I've counted.
Janet sat in the yard, surrounded by empty bottles. She had somehow discovered an old crate of liquor in the convent cellar.
What are you drinking?
Sean asked. Janet held up a glass proudly.
Whiskey sour.
Who taught you to make that? The label. How many have you had? She thought carefully. Enough. Enough? I briefly understood lizards. Sean blinked. What? They're judgmental. She nodded solemnly.
Little bastards.
Professor Voss pinched the bridge of his nose.
I don't even know where to begin.
Janet smiled dreamily. I recommend beginning with Moo Goo. Moo Goo? It sounds comforting. She promptly toppled sideways into the grass and began snoring. Ralph landed beside her. I'd help, but she's approximately 1 whiskey sour away from believing she's the Eiffel Tower. He looked around thoughtfully. You know. Everyone groaned.
No. I wasn't going to say anything inappropriate.
That's never stopped you before. Ralph cleared his throat. I've occasionally wondered what it'd be like to jump from an 11-story balcony. I imagine somewhere around the 6th floor you'd realize gravity has no customer service department. Around the 4th floor you'd regret every poor decision you've ever made, and by the 2nd floor you'd probably wish you'd stayed home polishing rosary beads instead. Silence. Sean nodded. Disturbingly sensible. I have my moments. Near midnight, Youngblood was found. Not beneath the bridge, above it. His long braids had become hopelessly tangled around the decorative steel railing, overlooking the brick path leading toward both the convent and the church. He was battered, bruised, barely conscious, but alive. Chaos was nowhere in sight. Professor Voss and Sean carefully helped him down. Youngblood's eyes fluttered open. He whispered, It isn't... What? The tunnel... His breathing caught. It doesn't. Professor Voss leaned closer. Youngblood. Youngblood looked directly at him. His face drained of every trace of color. There, he struggled to finish, is no tunnel. Silence. Everyone stared. Youngblood swallowed painfully. We've been calling it the wrong thing. Then he lost consciousness. Far below them, deep beneath the bridge, something laughed. Not cruelly, not kindly, almost knowingly. And in the tiny office behind the malt shop, the hidden wooden panel slowly swung shut by itself. Cora was still inside. No one on the surface had seen her enter. No one yet realized she was gone. Chapter 7. The light beneath the light. Bayou Sainte-Mere had developed a peculiar habit. It no longer woke up all at once. Pieces of it awakened separately. The church bells rang 6 minutes before sunrise. The museum clocks insisted it was nearly noon. The old river mist rolled inland long after the morning should have burned it away. Even the birds seemed uncertain whose morning they were singing. Professor Voss had stopped calling these things coincidences. He had begun calling them adjustments. Nobody liked the new word. Cora awoke in absolute darkness. She had no memory of lying down. The last thing she remembered was standing before the impossible figure holding the stone scepter beneath the malt shop. Now, silence, except someone breathing, not beside her, inside her thoughts. Chaos, not words, emotion, warmth, recognition. Professor Voss had once theorized that psychic gifts might run through bloodlines but require extraordinary circumstances to awaken. Everyone had laughed. Now the theory no longer seemed funny. Chaos had always possessed remarkable abilities: telekinesis, empathy, an instinct for finding people. Cora, however, had unknowingly become the other half of something larger. She didn't merely receive his thoughts. She became an echo chamber for them. Their minds touched like tuning forks. When one trembled, the other answered. She finally understood why she had always felt strangely protective of him despite spending years pretending to be merely his older sister. Blood had recognized blood long before either of them knew the truth. Chaos stumbled somewhere deeper within the labyrinth. The tunnel, or whatever Youngblood insisted it truly was, had changed again. The walls curved inward now. Ancient limestone gave way to polished black stone. Ahead, a room, perfectly circular, perfectly silent, perfectly wrong. At its center yawned a great opening in the earth. Not a pit. Not exactly. A doorway. It radiated impossible light. Sea green, periwinkle, gold, brilliant white. Each color occupied the same space without blending. Chaos found himself utterly mystified. He stepped closer. Immediately, Cora saw exactly what he saw. She gasped aloud. The vision was unmistakable. Somewhere beyond that impossible brilliance, Dorothea still lived. She wasn't trapped. She had crossed. The realization struck both minds simultaneously. This wasn't merely another section beneath Bayou Saint-Mier. It was another dimension. Not heaven. Not hell. Simply elsewhere. Chaos whispered, "Dottie!" The light answered by gently expanding. Then Chaos disappeared. Not falling. Not walking. Simply absent. His thoughts vanished from Cora's mind as though someone had quietly closed an enormous door. She screamed. Back above ground, baby Germaine began crying. Not ordinary crying. Searching. The sort of cry infants reserve for someone whose absence they somehow understand. Sean hurried into the nursery. The crib was untouched. The blanket folded. Chaos's jacket still hung over the chair. Only Chaos himself had vanished. Sean stood perfectly still. His stomach tightened.
No.
Meanwhile, across town, Loon drove far faster than Merrick considered advisable. Their aging Kia rattled violently as it bounced along the old road toward the convent. "I told you they'd need to know." "I know. They have to know." "I know." The tires screamed around another corner. Suddenly, "Janet!" The slime troll wandered into the road, carrying 3 peaches and singing something hopelessly off-key. Merrick slammed the brakes. Too late. The Kia bumped Janet. Not violently. More like an unexpectedly enthusiastic handshake. Janet performed what Professor Voss would later describe as an unnecessary somersault, landed safely in a ditch, looked upward, and announced,
"I've had worse Tuesdays,"
then promptly fainted. Loon buried her face in the steering wheel. "I cannot believe we just ran over Janet." Merrick nodded.
"She's going to be insufferable about this."
They reached the convent 15 minutes later, carrying 2 astonishing discoveries. Professor Voss met them outside.
"What happened?"
Loon answered first. "We accidentally hit Janet."
I'll put that second.
Second. Professor Voss nodded.
What's first?
Merrick carefully unfolded several brittle maps. "We were cleaning house at my grandfather's place." Professor Voss froze. "Cleaning house? We found these hidden inside a sock puppet." Nobody questioned the sock puppet. Bayou Saint-Mere had long ago stopped questioning containers. Merrick spread the maps across the table. Everyone leaned closer. The oldest map clearly showed no tunnel. Instead, a vast underground complex labeled the River of Doors. Professor Voss slowly sat down. "Holy!" Sean looked over.
"What?"
"The bridge."
"What about it?"
"It isn't crossing water." Silence. Professor Voss tapped the map. "It was built
"To cross this."
Youngblood, bandaged but stubbornly awake, quietly entered the room. He stared at the map, then smiled sadly. "I told you." Professor Voss nodded. "You did. We've been calling it the wrong thing." "What is it?" Youngblood looked toward the church. "It's the shoreline." "The shoreline?" He nodded.
"Not of a river."
Everyone waited.
"Of worlds."
Loon unfolded another page.
"There's more."
"What?" "My grandfather wrote notes in the margin." Professor Voss adjusted his glasses. He read aloud. "When the Fraulein rises beyond the trees." He stopped, looked toward Clotilde, continued. "The keeper shall remember the river." Another line. "The woman raised by love will open the door." Another. "The son raised by strangers will cross first." Silence filled the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Chaos. Dorota. Everything suddenly aligned. 2 entirely separate mysteries had quietly become one. Ralph landed on the table.
You know,
"This whole thing reminds me of those rumors of a haunted mansion where everybody says the ghost is terribly dangerous, until somebody finally meets him and discovers he's mostly disappointed in modern wallpaper." Professor Voss blinked. "Oddly comforting."
I try."
Janet slowly regained consciousness. "My head hurts." Sean smiled with relief. "You'll live."
I know.
She sat upright. "Did Kia apologize?"
"It certainly did."
"Good." She frowned.
I still think it owes me pesos.
As evening settled over Bayou Saint-Mere, the wind stopped. Every leaf became perfectly still. Clotilde quietly stepped onto the convent porch. Nobody noticed at first. Then, her shoes left the wood. 1 foot. 5. 10. 20. She kept rising. Higher than before. Past the rooftop. Past the tallest oak. Past the church steeple itself. Her eyes glowed faintly with reflected sea green and gold. Far above, she slowly raised one hand, not waving, pointing toward the stars. Then every window in Bayou Saint-Mer flashed brilliant white simultaneously. Professor Voss looked upward, suddenly too horrified to speak. Youngblood whispered only 3 words.
It's opening again.
And Clotilde continued rising. Higher and higher, until she vanished into the night sky altogether. Chapter 8. The Languages of the River. The first seizure came just before sunrise. Gumbo was buttering toast. One moment he was humming an old hymn under his breath. The next, the butter knife slipped from his hand. His eyes remained open. His entire body stiffened. The room froze. "Gumbo!" Sean shouted. Professor Voss caught him before he struck the floor. It lasted only 12 seconds. When it ended, Gumbo sat upright immediately.
Why's everybody staring?
You don't remember? Remember what? Without another word, he reached calmly for a pencil. Nobody handed him one. He simply picked one up from the table. His eyes clouded. His hand began moving. Not writing. Flying. Page after page filled with symbols no one recognized. Circles folded inside, impossible geometric figures. Maps that refused to remain the same shape. Words appeared. Not in sentences. Like fragments someone had dropped while hurrying. Prototype. Transeptication. Transfiguration. The wheels of justice turn underneath the water. He sent me. Then, the pencil snapped. Gumbo blinked. Who broke my pencil? Professor Voss carefully gathered the pages. I don't believe this is possession. What then? Asked Sean. I think, he adjusted his spectacles, his conscious mind is briefly stepping aside. For what? So another memory can write. Nobody found that comforting. Then Loon entered. Good morning, mates. Everyone looked up. Professor Voss frowned. Loon?
What?
Why are you speaking with an Australian accent? She blinked. I'm speaking perfectly normal. No, Sean replied.
You absolutely are not.
Loon looked horrified.
I sound funny.
A little? You sound like you wrestle crocodiles before breakfast. Within an hour, the phenomenon spread. Nobody escaped it. Gumbo now spoke in a gentle Irish accent. Clotilde answered, everyone in elegant French accented English. Merrick sounded unmistakably Scottish. Professor Voss, to his immense embarrassment, now possessed a crisp German accent even stronger than before. Youngblood somehow acquired a warm Jamaican cadence. Janet delighted everyone by suddenly speaking with an energetic Cockney accent. Ain't this brilliant? She declared happily. No, Sean sighed. It really isn't. Cora spoke softly in a rich South African accent she had never heard before. Even little Anna, while gently rocking baby Germain with tiny healing pulses of light, let out the sweetest little Welsh-accented whinny imaginable. Baby Germain giggled. Apparently, babies accepted impossible things much more gracefully than adults. Professor Voss paced. This isn't random. No? Asked Clotilde.
No.
The River of Doors. Everyone nodded.
I believe.
He hesitated. We're hearing echoes.
Echoes?
Versions of ourselves. Silence. The doors aren't merely connecting places. He tapped Gumbo's automatic writing. They're connecting lives. Outside, the faceplant stirred. Only one spoke. Its tiny leafy mouth opened slowly. Its expression carried genuine sorrow. The giving. Long pause. The living. Another pause. The forgiving. Its leaves trembled violently. The needing. One final whisper. Must stop perusing. Every faceplant simultaneously turned toward the church. Then every leaf on every stem drooped. The feeling that washed across the convent grounds could not be called fear. Fear was too small. It felt like an entire town realizing it had forgotten something essential. Janet whispered, "Poppycock." Nobody corrected her. Nobody believed it. Professor Voss quietly unfolded another page of Gumbo's writing. More words. Odd words. Dog attack. Relief boat ramp. Big thicket. Myrtle plantation. Neon signs. Gift shop. Sean frowned. What does any of that mean? Professor Voss looked thoughtful. They aren't instructions. No? I think, he swallowed, they're landmarks. Far away, Dorothea walked beneath a sky that contained no sun, yet everything glowed. The trees shimmered with impossible foliage, bright white leaves, sea-green trunks, golden shadows. People wandered quietly through the landscape. None seemed frightened, only confused. Dorothea had somehow become their organizer. You stay together, she pointed gently. You two help him. She smiled at an elderly woman. Nobody wanders off. A little boy tugged her sleeve. When are we going home? Dorothea smiled. When we find where home is. Even here, she had become everyone's mother. Back in Bayou Saint Mere, a tiny humming sound filled the convent. Nobody knew its source, until Scott appeared. No footsteps, no announcement. Simply, there, floating gently 6 inches above the floor, armless, legless, limitless, smiling. Ralph looked at him. Oh, kindly gracious, you're becoming impossible to surprise. Scott laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Janet pointed excitedly. Scott! Scott nodded. Janet, I've got a Cockney accent. I know. I rather like it.
I know.
Professor Voss cautiously stepped forward. Scott, Scott smiled. You've been looking in the wrong direction. We have? Always. What should we do? Scott slowly looked toward baby Germaine. The child reached up and giggled. Scott's expression softened. Then he quietly spoke. Everyone keeps asking where the door is. Nobody breathed. Scott laughed again. The door has been asking where you are. Silence. Then Ralph cleared his throat. Well, that's the most encouragingly unhelpful thing I've heard all week. Even Scott laughed at that. The tension broke. For the first time since Dorothea vanished, everyone smiled. Even Gumbo. Suddenly, Gumbo stiffened again. Another trance. Another page. His hand wrote only one sentence this time. When the spotlight finds the disco ball, the last memory will return. The pencil fell. Outside, the wind stopped. Clotilde slowly rose from her chair. No. Sean whispered. She continued rising. Past the ceiling. Straight through it without leaving so much as a splinter. Everyone rushed outside. She climbed higher than ever before. Higher than the church. Higher than the tallest oaks. Higher than the circling hawks. Her French-accented voice drifted faintly down from the clouds.
I can see.
She stopped. Her face became radiant with astonishment. Far above Bayou Saint-Mere, hundreds, no, thousands of tiny floating lights had appeared. Each one looked exactly like another Scot, watching, waiting, smiling. And every one of them turned at exactly the same moment towards something still farther above them all. Chapter 9. The School That Read the Wind. By the 9th morning, Bayou Saint-Mere had become a town that no longer trusted mornings. People still woke. Coffee still brewed. The church bells still rang. But everyone waited for the day's impossibility to introduce itself. It never disappointed. Gumbo never went to bed. Or rather, his body did. His mind clearly had other arrangements. Throughout the night, he drifted in and out of short, trance-like episodes. Each time his eyes became distant. Each time he reached automatically for another pencil, another notebook, another envelope, another bank receipt, another grocery list, anything that would hold ink. By sunrise, the dining room table had disappeared beneath hundreds of handwritten pages. Some contained only a single sentence. Others looked like entire conversations. Many were impossible to read because the handwriting changed every few paragraphs, as though dozens of unseen authors had politely taken turns borrowing Gumbo's hand. Sean stood silently beside the mountain of paper. "That's all one night?" Cora nodded. He never once remembered writing any of it. Professor Voss carefully lifted the first stack.
What do they say?
Sean laughed, nervously.
I was hoping you'd tell me.
W. Instead, Cora sat down. She didn't read the words. She listened to them. The psychic bond she had formed with chaos seemed strangely alive inside the pages themselves. Certain sentences almost glowed in her thoughts. She began separating them into piles. Sean noticed. "You're organizing them."
No.
"What then?" Hours passed. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The pages were not random. They were arranged like a conversation between two mothers. One voice repeated the word raised. The other repeated born. Again, and again, and again. Finally, Cora read one passage aloud. One mother teaches a child where home is. Another mother teaches a child where he came from. Neither love is greater. Both are required before the river remembers its own name. Sean swallowed. "Dorothea
And me,"
Cora whispered. For years, she'd quietly accepted being seen as Chaos's older sister. Now the pages insisted something else. Chaos had never been divided between two mothers. He had been completed by them. Dorothea had raised his heart. Cora had unknowingly carried the key to his memory. Across town, the old school for the blind had become strangely restless. Teachers spoke in whispers. Several students insisted they could hear colors. Others claimed empty hallways sounded crowded. One adult resident who was already on thin ice for secretly circulating an embossed Braille romance novel that violated school rules sat alone outside the library, awaiting a disciplinary meeting. When Clotilde arrived to deliver donated books and supplies from the convent, the resident suddenly stood. She tilted her head, then smiled. "I know your voice." Clotilde looked puzzled. "We've never met."
No.
"But someone inside my dreams has." Before anyone could react, the resident gently grasped Clotilde's sleeve. Immediately, the wind stopped. Every tree on the grounds leaned toward them. Clotilde sighed.
Oh, no.
Her shoes left the pavement. The other woman rose with her. Still holding Clotilde's sleeve, both drifted upward together. 10 feet, 20, 30. "Holy heavens!" shouted a teacher. The two women floated higher, above the gymnasium, above the flagpole, above the rooftop. Then a powerful current of unseen air carried them beyond the school grounds toward the neighboring county. Clotilde called down apologetically in her elegant French-accented English, "I assure everyone this is becoming as inconvenient for me as it appears." Professor Voss hurried to the museum. The talking moosehead was already awake. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," it said.
"We've lost Clotilde." "I know."
"We've lost Dorothea."
I know.
"We've lost Chaos."
I know.
Professor Voss rubbed his forehead. "I was hoping you might have something encouraging." The moose considered this, then spoke quietly. "Words of wisdom." Professor Voss waited. "The river never steals."
It doesn't?
"It only returns people to questions they never finished asking." The professor frowned.
"I don't understand."
"Good." The moose smiled faintly. "That means you're listening." Back at the convent, the talking kidney stone suddenly cleared its non-existent throat.
"I should like to pray."
No one interrupted. In its tiny, gravelly voice it whispered, "Amen. Guide those who are lost. Comfort those who wait. Grant courage to those rebuilding hope. And remind the frightened that even the longest horizon eventually meets the morning." Silence followed. Even Ralph bowed his head. Outside, a group of stray cats gathered beneath the porch, not fighting, not begging, simply sitting in a perfect circle facing the church. Janet counted them. 21. Sean blinked.
How do you know?
"They told me." Nobody asked for clarification. By afternoon, Cora and Sean had translated nearly 70 pages. Certain words repeated obsessively. Ripple effect. Feeding. Kneading. Bleeding. Upwards and downers. Leather wallpaper. Biosphère. Personal effects. Candy jams. One entire page consisted only of a proverb. The child carried by 2 mothers walks farther than the child carried by 1. Sean quietly set that page aside. "I think that's for Chaos." Another page contained a baffling list. Mexican food. Mad Magazine. Versace suit. Handbag. Gun range. Blood spatter. Hiking trail. Professor Voss stared. "It reads like memories from different lives." Cora nodded. "I think that's exactly what it is." Ralph suddenly flew to the center of the room. "Before anyone panics again, allow me to explain proper igloo etiquette. First of all, never criticize another penguin's snow craftsmanship. Even though penguins don't build igloos, they'll still take it personally. Secondly, if you're invited into an igloo, compliment the insulation before discussing fish. Thirdly, don't arrive carrying a fright kite unless specifically requested, because somebody always loses an eyebrow. Fourthly, there are traditional igloos, ceremonial igloos, emergency igloos, and what I call architectural overconfidence with frozen consequences. Finally, if the host offers fermented seal soup, accept politely and pretend you've always wanted seconds. Civilization depends upon these things, and frankly, the world would be a calmer place if more people worried about igloo manners instead of arguing about wallpaper. The room remained silent. Janet finally nodded. I learned something. Sean looked at Ralph. I honestly can't tell whether any of that was true. It isn't, Ralph admitted, but it was comforting. As evening approached, a sheriff's deputy arrived from the neighboring county. His face had gone pale. We found Sister Clotilde.
Is she alive?
Cora asked.
Yes.
Where?
He hesitated, standing in the middle of an empty field.
And the other woman?
Gone.
What did Clotilde say? The deputy looked genuinely unsettled.
Only one sentence.
Everyone leaned forward. He swallowed. She kept pointing toward the sky and repeating. He looked directly at Cora. Dorothea has learned to mother the stars, and chaos is trying to teach them how to come home. The room fell silent. Outside, the stray cats all stood at exactly the same moment. Then, without a sound, they turned together and stared toward the darkening horizon. Chapter 10. The Mirror Room. No one spoke after the deputy left. The stray cats remained fixed upon the horizon as though waiting for permission to blink. Professor Voss quietly folded Gumbo's pages into careful stacks. The messages are changing, he said. Sean nodded. They're becoming less like warnings and more like instructions. That evening Gumbo slipped into another trance. His pencil moved so quickly that the pages tore beneath it. He filled page after page with names, arrows, circles, fragments of songs, and strange phrases. Then, in enormous letters stretching across 3 sheets of paper, he wrote, The Mirror Room remembers conception. The pencil stopped. Gumbo blinked. Did somebody say snack time? Janet immediately raised her hand. I support that motion. The hidden chamber beneath the museum was unlike any room they had yet discovered. Its walls were covered with polished mirrors. Not modern mirrors. Old ones. Silver-backed. Clouded by age. Each reflected something slightly different. Sean looked into one and saw himself as a child riding a tricycle. Professor Voss glanced into another and briefly saw shelves filled with a box of crayons instead of ancient books. Janet peered into a third. Why am I eating cottage cheese while arguing with a kangaroo? Nobody answered. The mirrors seldom explained themselves. Scott appeared without announcement. He floated gently into the center of the chamber, smiling as though he had arrived exactly on schedule. The room is awake, he said softly. Professor Voss looked around. What does it remember? Scott touched one of the mirrors with the side of his face. It remembers beginnings. Beginnings of what? Scott smiled. Families. Another mirror shimmered. Instead of reflections, words slowly appeared. A child may be born once, but may be welcomed many times. Love is never divided. It multiplies. Cora quietly began to cry. Dorothea had raised chaos. She had given him his home. Cora had given him life. Neither truth diminished the other. The river had never been trying to separate them. It had been trying to reconcile them. The talking kidney stone cleared its tiny, gravelly voice. "I have a little advice." Everyone looked over. "Humility will carry you farther than certainty." It paused. "When tension grows, speak gently." Another pause. "And never mistake fragility for weakness." Even Ralph remained silent. "That," the parrot admitted, "is considerably better advice than my igloo lecture." Outside, preparations for the county fair continued despite the strange happenings. Someone insisted normal life should continue. The Ferris wheel turned. Children laughed. A Zydeco band tuned their instruments. The scent of popcorn, ham sandwiches, and roasted pecans drifted through the warm evening air. Scott had agreed to perform. Not a song. Simply his humming. People gathered anyway. Some came out of curiosity, some from excitement, others because rumors had spread that hearing Scott hum made grief feel lighter. When Scott began, the fairgrounds became utterly still. His single note hung in the air like sunlight finding stained glass. It grew richer, warmer. Children stopped running. Arguments dissolved. Even a nearby dog stopped panting and quietly lay down. A woman who had spent the afternoon ranting about parking simply smiled at a stranger. The Zydeco musicians lowered their instruments and listened with tears in their eyes. Professor Voss whispered, Sean nodded.
"I think he's repairing something."
Near the livestock barns, Sheriff Delacroix intercepted 2 teenagers carrying contraband fireworks. "County rules," he sighed. "You'll have to hand those over." Janet wandered by and asked, "Does this count as target practice?"
No.
"What about rubbish disposal?"
"Also no."
She shrugged and wandered off, muttering about poppy seeds and how unfairly they were treated in muffins. Later that night, Sean discovered another of Gumbo's pages tucked beneath a chair. It contained only scattered words.
Wabash.
Rebirth. Utility. Indictment. Suspicion. Hunch. Human stains wash away. Love doesn't. Professor Voss looked thoughtful. "The river speaks in symbols." Ralph nodded. "Thankfully. Imagine if it spoke in tax forms." A local police officer arrived carrying a folder. "We searched the abandoned apartment building overlooking the old strip mall." "What did you find?" Sean asked. "Nothing conclusive." He hesitated. There was vomit in one hallway, broken glass, lotion on a bathroom shelf, tree limbs scattered across a roof after last night's wind, and enough debris that we requested a cleanup crew. "Anything connected to the tunnels?" A shattered mirror. The room fell quiet.
And
He swallowed. Someone had written Samson and Delilah across one wall. Professor Voss exchanged a glance with Cora. Another clue. Another beginning. Janet wandered over carrying a paper cup.
anybody want lemonade?
"No, thank you," Sean replied. She nodded. "Fair enough." Then she frowned. "You know, whoever invented the phrase blackmail should have chosen happier wording." Ralph looked at her.
I believe you mean blackmail.
"That's what I said." "You said blackmail."
"I did?"
"You did?" Ha! She sipped her lemonade. Language is exhausting. The fair slowly emptied. Scott's humming lingered in everyone's memory long after the final note faded. People who had arrived burdened with worry left strangely peaceful. For the first time in days, hope outweighed fear. Only slightly, but enough. Then the scream came. Everyone turned toward the old hotel bordering the fairgrounds. High above, on the 11th-story balcony, a solitary figure clung desperately to the outside railing, one hand slipping, feet searching for purchase, too far away to identify. Sean stared upward.
Correct.
Professor Voss shaded his eyes.
No.
Janet whispered. Who is that? Scott looked up. For the first time since anyone had known him. His smile disappeared. Very quietly, he said, "We're almost out of time." The figure's grip slipped, and the chapter ended before anyone below could see who it was. Chapter 11. The Mothers of the River. The morning began with 2 screams. The first came from the swamp. The second came from the convent garden. Neither proved to be an exaggeration. Youngblood and Merrick found the wild pigs first. 2 of them lay dead near the cypress line, not torn apart by any familiar predator, but crushed with impossible force. Their heavy shoulders bore strange crescent-shaped punctures. Professor Voss knelt beside one. "I've never seen anything like this." Loon pointed toward the mud. "What kind of tracks are those?" The prints resembled enormous spider legs, only heavier, far heavier. From the reeds emerged a creature the size of a large dog. Its shell glowed blue-gray beneath the morning light. Its claws were enormous. It calmly cracked open a fallen coconut someone had left from the previous festival as though it were an eggshell. Professor Voss quietly backed away. A coconut crab. "In Louisiana?" Sean whispered. "It shouldn't be."
Hey.
Ralph landed on a fence post. "I've seen ghosts, impossible tunnels, floating nuns, and philosophical vegetables. Somehow that is what finally bothers me." The crab slowly turned toward the convent. Its claws clicked once. Then it disappeared into the swamp. Nobody followed. Inside the convent, Clotilde began levitating again. This time, everyone saw it coming. Her feet rose gently from the kitchen floor. Then another foot. Then another. Suddenly she cried out. Tiny wounds appeared in her palms and feet. Professor Voss stared in disbelief. Youngblood quietly crossed himself. Clotilde's breathing became ragged. Then everyone gasped. A small tail, no longer than a child's hand, appeared at the base of her spine. It twitched once, twice. Her eyes slowly opened. There were no pupils.
No irises.
Only a luminous, unsettling orange. She spoke in a calm voice that did not sound entirely like her own. "The door refuses to close." She floated higher. "Because 2 mothers still believe they failed." Then she went silent. Cora stepped forward. "No." Everyone looked at her. "I finally understand." She turned toward Gumbo. "You and Dorothea never stole chaos from me." Gumbo's eyes filled. "You gave him everything I couldn't." Sean nodded gently. "And now," Cora smiled through tears,
"My part isn't to replace Dorothea.
"No."
My part
"Is to remember him." Professor Voss suddenly slapped one of Gumbo's notebooks. "That's it." "What?" the automatic writing. He flipped through dozens of pages. Every page about mothers had been paired with another page about memory. Not biology, not destiny. Memory. The river had never cared who gave birth. It cared who remembered someone into becoming themselves. Dorothea had remembered chaos into courage. Cora remembered him into identity. Only together could the path home remain open. Youngblood smiled faintly. So that's why the river kept saying both mothers mattered. Far away, chaos stood beside the shimmering opening. Sea green, periwinkle, gold, brilliant white. He looked into the impossible light. I know she's here. Somewhere beyond it. Dorothea turned suddenly, as though hearing him across worlds. They could not yet see one another, but both smiled. The distance between them had become hope instead of emptiness. That evening, everyone gathered around the long convent kitchen table. Gumbo, Clotilde, Youngblood, Cora, Sean, Professor Voss, Janet, Lune, Merrick, Ralph, little Anne gently rocking baby Germain with tiny pulses of warm light. Gumbo stood.
I've been writing things I don't understand.
He looked around the room. But I understand this. He reached for Cora's hand. Then the empty chair Dorothea should have occupied. Families aren't made by choosing one love over another, Sean continued. They're made when everyone refuses to stop loving. The river, Cora added, keeps showing us mothers because motherhood isn't ownership. It's shelter. It's memory. It's the promise that someone will still call your name after you've disappeared. Even Janet quietly wiped away a tear. Ralph whispered, Well, that's inconveniently beautiful. Preparations resumed for the festival where Scott would perform his humming. The master of ceremonies rehearsed introductions. Ladies and gentlemen. He stopped. And everyone else gathered here. Ralph interrupted. You've forgotten Scott. I have? Scott transcends introductions. Nobody argued. Meanwhile, behind the old malt shop, Sean heard a loud crash. He ran into the alley. Professor Voss lay upside down inside an enormous, discarded advertising barrel that had somehow rolled over him. Only his shoes and spectacles protruded. My dignity, the professor muttered, appears to have resigned. Janet laughed so hard she slid down the brick wall. Even Youngblood doubled over. Ralph nearly fell off a drain pipe. I've waited my entire life, the parrot wheezed, to witness a world-renowned scholar defeated by basic geometry. Professor Voss finally crawled free.
I request,
he dusted himself off, that this never be mentioned again. No promises, said Merrick. At the School for the Blind, the student who faced expulsion over the prohibited Braille romance sat quietly awaiting the final decision. The room became strangely still. Every Braille page in the building suddenly began to rise, not high, just enough to flutter. The raised dots rearranged themselves. Teachers rushed from classroom to classroom. Every single page textbooks, hymnals, dictionaries, even attendance records now bore the same embossed sentence. Love reads what eyes cannot. The principal slowly removed his glasses. He looked toward the student. Believe there are larger mysteries demanding our attention. Her expulsion was quietly postponed. Night settled over Bayou St. Mia. Scott arrived silently. He smiled. The breeze carried a gentle zephyr across the festival grounds. Far beyond the lights, somewhere near the swamp, the coconut crab raised one claw toward the stars. Clotilde floated once more higher than the church steeple, her glowing orange eyes fixed on the heavens. Then she whispered words that made Professor Voss turn pale.
They're on the cusp.
What? Sean asked. Clotilde's voice trembled. Everyone. She looked toward the impossible horizon. When the fan begins to turn. She stopped herself, as though the sentence itself resisted being spoken. The last door will remember its keeper. And somewhere beyond the river of doors, Dorothea reached toward a light that looked remarkably like home. Chapter 12. The Things That Wait Patiently. By the 12th day, Bayou Saint-Mihiel had acquired a new custom. Nobody asked anyone how they had slept. The answers had become too unsettling. Instead, they asked gentler questions. Did the river leave you alone? Did your dreams have doors?
Did you wake up yourself?
Oddly enough, everyone understood what those questions meant. The convent kitchen was unusually peaceful. For the first time in weeks, no one was floating. No mysterious lights burst through the ceiling. No impossible maps rearranged themselves. Professor Voss regarded the silence with profound suspicion.
I don't trust quiet.
Sean smiled. You don't trust Tuesdays. I've had difficult Tuesdays. Janet wandered in carrying a saucepan. I made breakfast. Everyone froze. Should we be frightened? Asked Merrick.
A prudent person probably would be.
What is it? She proudly removed the lid.
It was supposed to be oatmeal.
And? It developed ambitions. Ralph peered into the pot.
I've seen concrete with better table manners.
Gumbo had stopped trying to resist the automatic writing. Whenever the strange trances arrived, someone simply slid fresh paper beneath his hand. He awoke afterward with no memory, accepted a cup of coffee, and asked if anyone had solved yesterday's crossword. This morning's pages proved remarkably different. No frantic diagrams. No impossible symbols. Instead, entire paragraphs. Sean read aloud. Truth grows like a seed. Greed buries it. Love waters it. Memory harvests it. Professor Voss smiled. He's becoming clearer. No, said Cora quietly. They're becoming closer. Cora had begun noticing subtle changes in her connection with chaos. She no longer merely heard echoes. Sometimes she experienced flashes of his emotions, astonishment, wonder, homesickness, hope, never fear. That comforted her. She closed her eyes. For one fleeting instant, she smelled rain. Not Louisiana rain. Something cleaner. She heard Dorothea laughing. Then the vision faded.
He's with her.
Sean looked up. You know that?
I don't know how.
She smiled softly.
I simply know.
Far beyond the river of doors, Dorothea walked beneath enormous silver trees. The leaves chimed whenever the breeze touched them. She remembered another wind, another place, another life. A flashback returned. She was 19 years old, a novice nun, shy, studious, still learning when to speak and when silence carried greater wisdom. One stormy evening she had been assigned to polish an abandoned chapel on convent property. Everyone insisted no one used it anymore. While sweeping beneath the old altar, she had discovered a tiny wooden hatch. She opened it. Only an inch. Just enough to hear. Humming. Not voices. Not machinery. Simply humming. A melody impossibly similar to Scott's. Mother Agnes had appeared instantly. Closed the hatch. Taken Dorothea gently by both shoulders. Then whispered words she had never forgotten. Some doors belong to history. A pause. Others belong to mercy. Another pause. Never confuse the two. The memory ended. Dorothea stopped walking beneath the silver trees.
Mother Agnes knew.
Someone behind her answered.
Yes.
She turned. Chaos stepped from the glowing forest. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They embraced. Home had become a person. Back in Bayou Saint-Mere, not every mystery belonged to the river. Sean had noticed the same battered pickup truck 3 mornings in a row. The same man leaning against it, watching. Always watching. Brigsby. Not smiling. Not waving. Simply observing. Young blood joined Sean on the porch. He's back.
I know.
You think it's connected? Sean shook his head.
No.
Then why? Sean frowned. I think Brigsby has a bone to pick with me over something entirely different.
What?
Sean sighed.
I honestly have no idea.
Ralph landed nearby. I've always distrusted people who stalk before introducing themselves. It's inefficient. Brigsby tipped his hat, then drove away without saying a word. Professor Voss spent the afternoon perusing Gumbo's newest writings. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Homeward bound. Another. The practice round is over. Sean frowned. Practice round. Professor Voss nodded slowly. If that's true...
What?
Everything we've survived so far has merely been preparation. Nobody liked that conclusion. Outside, a caterpillar crawled peacefully along the convent fence. Janet crouched beside it. Hello. The caterpillar continued crawling. A nearby snail inched closer. Janet nodded solemnly.
I believe you've made a friend of the snails.
Ralph looked over. I've witnessed stranger diplomatic relationships. That evening everyone gathered in the kitchen again. The long table overflowed with food. Roasted vegetables. Fresh bread. Stew. Peach cobbler. Even Janet's oatmeal had been quietly retired to the compost heap. Loon raised a glass. To absent friends. To homeward bound, Merrick added. Gumbo smiled. To family. Everyone nodded. Even the empty chairs reserved for Dorothea and Chaos somehow felt less lonely. After supper, Sean and Cora stepped outside. The air felt turbulent. Clouds rode across the moon. You ever think, Sean asked, that we're all changing? We already have.
I mean permanently.
Cora considered it. I don't think the river changes people. What then? It removes everything that isn't true. Sean laughed softly. That's tantamount to changing. She smiled. I suppose it is. Later that night, Ralph perched atop the porch railing. You know, he announced, people spend entirely too much time worrying about sweepstakes, keepsakes, beefcakes, and whether a sword fight would improve municipal government. Personally, I'd rather have a comfortable chair, a decent snack, and neighbors who don't keep finding portals to alternate realities. Janet nodded. Reasonable. I have my moments. Before everyone retired, the talking kidney stone spoke one final time. The secret truth is seldom loud. It paused. Listen when kindness whispers. No one answered. No one needed to. Long after midnight, a zephyr stirred the oak branches. The river of doors shimmered beneath the town. Far away, Dorothea and Chaos began walking together toward a distant horizon where impossible lights waited patiently. And on the edge of Bayou St. Mere, Brigsby parked his truck beneath an old bridge, climbed out and quietly unfolded a faded photograph. It was not of Dorothea, not of Chaos, not of the convent. It was a decades-old photograph of Sean. On the back, in faded handwriting, were 4 unsettling words. He was always coming. Brigsby folded the photograph carefully, smiled to himself, and whispered into the darkness, "About time." Somewhere unseen, something answered with a single soft knock, as though another door had just decided it was ready to be opened. Chapter 13. The Woman Beyond the Glass. The town awoke beneath a sky the color of polished opal. Nobody remarked upon it. Bayou St. Mere had reached a point where impossible things were no longer surprising. They were merely added to the day's schedule. Professor Voss even wrote them on a chalkboard. Morning. Feed the stray cats. Check on Clottled. Translate Gumbo. Hope reality cooperates. Janet looked at the list. I appreciate optimism. Gumbo's automatic writing had become impossible to manage. 1 notebook became 3. 3 became 14. Loose pages drifted through the convent like autumn leaves. He no longer needed pencils. Ink pens emptied themselves in his hand. Markers dried from overuse. Even charcoal found its way into his fingers. He wrote on envelopes, napkins, old calendars, a bank draft someone had forgotten inside a cookbook, the margins of Professor Voss's lecture notes, the backs of grocery receipts. At one point he unknowingly wrote across the front of a casserole recipe. Sean sighed. I suppose we'll never know how much paprika belonged in that. The words no longer arrived in orderly paragraphs. They came like rivers overflowing their banks. Fragments collided. Stories interrupted one another. One page read, Holding pattern. Another, Catch and release. Another, The valuable thing isn't finding the door. Another, It's remembering why you entered. Professor Voss spread hundreds of pages across the convent dining room. The papers looked like an enormous puzzle. We're doing this backward. What do you mean? Merrick asked. We're reading them. Aren't we supposed to? No? He tilted one page sideways. Suddenly several sentences lined up with words on another sheet. Cora gasped. They're one enormous manuscript. Professor Voss smiled. Gumbo hasn't been writing pages. He has been writing 1 book. Meanwhile, at the School for the Blind, the student whose expulsion over the forbidden Braille romance had been postponed quietly returned several volumes to the library. The principal approached gently. We've reconsidered. She stiffened. I know the rule. The rules remain. She lowered her head. I understand. But so do mercy and context. He smiled kindly. You're staying. She covered her face with trembling hands. Thank you. As she walked away, she brushed her fingers across a Braille hymn book. For the briefest instant, the raised dots warmed beneath her touch. The river had quietly resolved another wound, not by magic, by compassion. Late that afternoon, the mirror room began humming. Not Scott's melody. Something older. The mirrors clouded over. Every reflection disappeared. Then one mirror brightened. A woman stood on the opposite side. She was neither young nor old, neither ordinary nor frightening. She seemed almost woven from moonlight. Professor Voss whispered, Conception. She smiled. I wondered how long it would take. Nobody moved. She gently placed her hand against the glass. The mirror rippled, like water. Then she stepped through, only halfway, as though two worlds refused to release her completely. Scott emerged behind her, smiling exactly as always. "You've done well." Sean finally found his voice. "Who are you?" Conception answered softly. "I remember beginnings." "And endings?"
I leave those to you.
Cora stepped closer. "Dorothea." Conception nodded. "She walks bravely." He chose love over certainty. Professor Voss looked bewildered. "They're alive? They have always been alive." Scott chuckled. "People confuse distance with absence." Conception smiled at him. "They usually do." The room felt warmer, gentler, less afraid. Before stepping backward through the mirror again, she spoke one final sentence. "The river cannot be crossed by one mother." She looked at Cora. Then toward the empty place Dorothea would one day fill again. "It has always required two." The mirror became solid once more. Scott remained. "She doesn't visit often," Professor Voss whispered. "I can see why." Outside, an alligator wandered lazily through the marsh beside the convent. Janet watched from a safe distance. "He looks off duty." Ralph landed nearby. "I've never trusted reptiles with leisure time." Preparations continued for Alligator Fest, an annual celebration everyone now agreed had become unintentionally overshadowed by supernatural events. The committee remained enthusiastic anyway. "If the end of the world arrives," Loon declared, "it can at least enjoy good gumbo." That evening, Sean finally solved another mystery left behind by Gumbo's earliest writings. The repeated references to feeding, kneading, bleeding, and memory had never described the river. They described baby Germain. Professor Voss looked astonished. "The child?" Sean nodded. "The river responds whenever he's near." "Why?" Cora smiled. "Because he has never known division." Everyone fell silent. Germain had been loved by everyone from the beginning. He represented the future the river was trying to protect. One more lingering mystery quietly fell into place. Later, Ralph watched a flock of birds circling above the convent. "You know," he announced, "life resembles a smorgasbord. Some days you receive pie. Other days existential dread. The important thing is not confusing the two." Janet nodded thoughtfully. "I've done that before." "I suspected as much." Clouds gathered. A warm summer wind drifted across the swamp. The drought that had threatened nearby farms finally broke. Rain began softly, then steadily. The earth drank gratefully. Even the oldest oak seemed relieved. Far beyond the river, Dorothea paused beside Chaos. The silver forest had given way to open hills. Ahead stood something extraordinary, a tiny stone cottage. Smoke drifted from its chimney. A weathered pram rested beside the door as though waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. Chaos looked puzzled. "What is this place?" Dorothea smiled. "I think—" She touched the old wooden gate. "It's where memories live until someone is ready to remember them." The cottage door slowly opened by itself. Neither moved. Not yet. Some thresholds deserved a moment of quiet before crossing. And somewhere beneath Bayou Saint-Mere, Gumbo abruptly sat upright in bed, still asleep. His hand reached across the bedside table. Not for paper, not for a pen. Instead, his finger began writing directly onto the wooden tabletop itself. Letters appeared as if burned into the grain. Sean found them moments later. Only 3 words. "Don't open both." Before anyone could ask what it meant, every mirror in the convent cracked at exactly the same time. Chapter 14. The blue rose beneath the gulf. The morning after every mirror in the convent cracked, Bayou Saint-Mere felt strangely lighter, not happier. Lighter, as though some invisible pressure had finally exhaled. Professor Voss stood in the dining room studying the shattered glass that still clung stubbornly to its frames. "They've stopped breaking." Sean nodded. "Whatever happened?" "Finish something," Professor Voss replied. For the first time in weeks, Gumbo sat quietly at the kitchen table. No pencils, no notebooks, no involuntary writing. He simply drank coffee. His hands were still. "It stopped," Janet whispered. Gumbo smiled uneasily. "I think it did." Professor Voss wasn't convinced. He looked toward the ceiling. It said everything it intended to say. The piece lasted exactly 12 minutes. Then baby Germain laughed, not because anything was funny, because the old grandfather clock struck 9. Every clock in the convent answered, even those that had been broken for years. Professor Voss slowly opened Gumbo's final notebook. Only one page remained unwritten. Before anyone could touch it, words appeared by themselves, not in Gumbo's handwriting, not in anyone's. The ink seemed to bloom from inside the paper. Sean read aloud. "The river thanks you. The writing is finished. Do not mourn what has ended. Mourn only the door that still refuses to close. One shall return. One shall remain. Neither ending is defeat." The page folded shut by itself. Every pencil in the room snapped simultaneously. Gumbo exhaled.
My head,
He smiled. "Is finally quiet." The automatic writing was over. No one celebrated. The message carried both relief and sorrow. Youngblood stood abruptly. "We have to leave." Professor Voss frowned. "For where?" Youngblood looked toward the south. "The Gulf." By noon, Youngblood and Merrick were driving toward the coast. Professor Voss had chosen Merrick because, unlike everyone else, he had once spent a sabbatical volunteering with archaeologists along the Louisiana shoreline. "You've actually dug for relics before." "I mostly carried buckets." "Close enough." The old truck rolled south through marshes and tiny towns until they crossed into Cameron, Louisiana, where the Gulf stretched endlessly beneath a pale sky. Youngblood climbed out.
I've never been here.
"You have," Merrick replied. "What?" "In another life, perhaps." Neither laughed. "Back in Bayou St. Mere." Cora closed her eyes. The psychic bond with chaos had not disappeared. It had paused. She could no longer hear him. No emotions, no visions, only silence. Professor Voss became concerned.
Can you reach him?
She shook her head.
No.
"What do you feel?" She swallowed. "Like he's somewhere communication doesn't exist. Far beyond the river." Chaos stood inside an immense circular chamber. There were no doors, no windows, only light. Words existed there. Speech did not. Even thoughts dissolved before they could fully form. He understood somehow that this place had been created to prevent messages from crossing between worlds. He was safe, but unreachable. Dorothea stood outside the little stone cottage. Scott floated beside her. "You could come back."
I know.
"They miss you."
I know.
"They need you." She smiled sadly.
I know.
Scott waited. She rested one hand against the weathered wooden door. "If I leave now?" She looked toward the glowing forest beyond. "I think something unfinished stays unfinished forever." Scott never argued. He simply nodded. "Then I'll tell them."
No.
She looked gently at him.
Tell them I'm learning.
Scott smiled. "That's better." Meanwhile, Youngblood and Merrick followed ancient directions copied from Gumbo's final writings. Past the old screen porch, There, toward the blue rose tattoo painted on a weather-beaten bait shop. There.
Follow the tire tracks.
There. Pray. Merrick blinked. There are literally bread crumbs. Someone had scattered them through the dunes. Youngblood frowned. Either we're following a sacred trail, or very confused seagulls. They reached a lonely stretch of beach. Half buried beneath the sand lay an old iron pickaxe. Youngblood lifted it.
It isn't this.
No. He drove it into the sand anyway. On the third strike, metal struck wood. Together they uncovered a weathered cedar box. Inside rested a tiny talisman carved from oyster shell and cypress root. Its center held a perfect blue stone. An impossible blue. Professor Voss would later identify it as impossible. Youngblood simply whispered, "Beautiful." The shell glowed warmly. At that exact moment, Cora gasped hundreds of miles away. "I found you." Sean looked up. "What?" "The beach. You can see them?" "Nice." She smiled. "I know where to dig." The bond with chaos had vanished. Something else had replaced it. The river itself had begun answering. On the drive home, Merrick glanced at Youngblood. "You know, we've spent weeks playing the blame game." Youngblood nodded. "We blamed ourselves. The river. Dorothea." "Shao." He sighed. "Maybe nobody failed." Youngblood smiled. Maybe everyone was carrying exactly what they were supposed to. Back at the convent, Ralph cleared his throat dramatically. "I have an educational announcement regarding a practice known as frogging. Contrary to what the name suggests, it has very little to do with amphibians. Frogging is when a person secretly lives inside someone else's house without the homeowner realizing it. They hide in attics, crawl spaces, basements, behind walls, vacant storage rooms, or other overlooked places, often emerging only when the residents are asleep or away. It is extraordinarily dangerous, deeply unsettling, and absolutely criminal. Imagine discovering someone has been peeping from your own attic, trailing you through your daily routine without your knowledge. That isn't clever, it's terrifying. The possible outcomes range from theft to violent confrontation, and sometimes much worse. So here's my humble prayer. May every hidden intruder choose honesty over secrecy. May every homeowner remain safe. And may anyone tempted to try such nonsense instead find a proper apartment, a respectable landlord, and perhaps a hobby involving knitting or birdwatching." Professor Voss blinked. "That was unexpectedly practical. I contain multitudes." Festival preparations resumed. Janet accidentally glued her sleeve to a table with a glue gun. "It appears," she announced, "I've become part of the furniture." Sean laughed. "You really are a hot mess."
I've been called worse.
That evening, the moon rose enormous over the swamp. Professor Voss quietly noted it in his journal. End of another lunar cycle. The breeze smelled faintly of peaches and cream from a nearby ice cream stand, preparing for the festival. Children chased one another wearing cardboard pirate hats and plastic coonskin caps. Someone screened time bandits on a white sheet stretched between two oak trees. Janet wandered through the crowd wearing oversized rain boots and, for reasons she refused to explain, carrying a shopping bag that contained nothing but a neatly folded pair of little white cotton panties. Ralph looked into the bag. I've reached the point where I'm no longer asking questions. Then, the blue talisman suddenly grew warm in Youngblood's pocket, so warm it nearly burned his hand. He removed it. The stone floated upward.
Not high.
Just enough. Then it slowly turned, not toward the convent, not toward the tunnels, but toward the old abandoned chapel where Dorothea had once, as a young novice, heard mysterious humming beneath a forgotten hatch. Professor Voss stared at it. The exit, Sean finished the thought, was never underground. A deep bell rang from somewhere no one could see, and every person present understood that the next journey would begin not beneath Bayou Saint-Mere, but inside the oldest building anyone had almost forgotten.
Chapter 15. The Chapel at the Edge of the Woods. The festival arrived beneath clear skies. No one trusted them. After everything Bayou Saint-Mere had endured, beautiful weather often meant reality was preparing another surprise. Scott stood quietly behind the small stage where he would later perform his humming. He seemed perfectly calm, almost too calm. Professor Voss noticed. Scott smiled. Yes? You're worried. A little. About what? Scott looked toward the deep woods behind the convent. The exit. For the first half of the afternoon, the festival unfolded almost normally. Children chased balloons. Janet somehow won a stuffed yak at a ring toss booth, despite accidentally throwing all 3 rings behind her. Ralph landed atop the prize. I've always wanted a philosophical yak. It doesn't talk, Janet replied. It will once it lives here. Nearby, a drama queen from the neighbouring parish loudly declared that the lemonade stand had ruined summer forever. Nobody paid much attention. Then Gumbo collapsed, without warning. His entire body stiffened. A violent seizure sent cups crashing from the refreshment table. Sean caught him before his head struck the ground. Gumbo! Within minutes paramedics arrived. The decision was made quickly. Because of the unusual neurological symptoms that had plagued him throughout the river mystery, a medical helicopter was called. As the aircraft lifted toward Galveston, everyone watched in silence. Janet quietly whispered, I hate helicopters. Professor Voss placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He'll fight. The festival continued. Only a handful of people knew anything serious had happened. Scott insisted his performance went on. When people are frightened, he said softly, they need hope even more. His humming drifted across the grounds. The crowd relaxed. No one noticed the stage lights flicker. No one noticed every cracked mirror in town briefly reflected a stone chapel instead of the people standing before them. Late that evening, Sean, Professor Voss, and Cora slipped away from the celebration. They followed the narrow trail into the deep woods behind the convent. Beyond Janet's small cottage, beyond the pond, they reached the forgotten chapel Dorothea had once cleaned as a young novice. The little building leaned slightly with age. Vines wrapped around its bell tower. Its wooden door stood open. Inside, nothing had changed, except everything. The old hatch beneath the altar now stood completely open. No humming, only a soft white glow. Professor Voss slowly smiled. We found it. Sean nodded. The exit.
Bow!
Cora finished his sentence. Not the way back. Far beyond the River of Doors. Dorothea remained near the little stone cottage. The place rested in a broad valley surrounded by silver forests and slow-moving rivers that reflected unfamiliar constellations. The cottage was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. People arrived there confused, broken, lonely. Dorothea welcomed each one with tea, bread, blankets, and gentle conversation. She had become the keeper of the cottage, almost without realizing it. Scott appeared beside her. They found the chapel. I know. They're trying to bring you home. Dorothea looked toward the cottage. An elderly woman laughed inside. 2 frightened children were planting flowers outside. A man who had wandered silently for days had finally smiled. I can't leave them. They're not your responsibility. She smiled sadly. They became my responsibility the moment they believed they weren't alone. Scott nodded. He understood. Sometimes love rooted itself where no one expected. Elsewhere, chaos remained inside the chamber of light. The endless room where voices existed without language. He still could not send thoughts beyond its walls. Until... Gee! Chaos! He froze. Cora! Her voice echoed clearly inside his mind. Not through the river, not through the chamber, through blood. It worked. I can hear you. So can I. They spoke exactly as though talking over a telephone. No delay, no distortion. Chaos laughed. I've been trying to get to Mom. I know. She's alive. I know. She won't come back. Cora closed her eyes. I know that too. Silence lingered. What do we do? Chaos looked around the glowing chamber. The talisman. What about it? It belongs in the chapel. How? I don't know. The connection faded. Just before it disappeared, he whispered, Tell Mom. He stopped himself, then smiled. Tell Gumbo I finally understand why he taught me to be brave. The bond dissolved. Cora quietly wiped away tears. The next morning, Youngblood and Merrick returned to the Gulf Coast. This time they explored another small coastal community east of Cameron. The blue talisman had begun pointing south again. It wants something, Youngblood muttered. They searched old dunes until sunset, finding nothing. On their drive home, they stopped at a roadside tavern for supper. There they met two women who were funny, flirtatious, and entirely unimpressed by Youngblood's dramatic storytelling. Hours later, after the four had shared dinner, music, laughter, and gone their separate ways, Merrick suddenly reached into his jacket. Youngblood? What? My pocket. What about it? The talisman. Youngblood's smile vanished. It's gone. Back in Bayou St. Mere. Professor Voss stared at the open hatch beneath the chapel. It wasn't stolen by accident. Sean nodded. No. Someone knew exactly what they were taking. At the hospital in Galveston, doctors completed Gumbo's tests. To everyone's relief, there was no sign of permanent neurological injury. The seizures had exhausted him terribly, but he was expected to recover. When he finally awoke, he looked at the nurse and smiled weakly. I dreamed... What did you dream? That doors get lonely too. As midnight settled over Bayou St. Mere, another disturbance unfolded quietly behind the festival grounds. Near the pond beside Janet's cottage, someone discovered fresh buckshot embedded in an old kettle hanging from a tree. An ashtray lay overturned nearby. Boot prints crossed the muddy ditch. The scene looked hastily abandoned. Sean frowned. It almost looks like a mugshot without a camera. Professor Voss crouched to examine the ground. No, he pointed. Someone was waiting here. For whom? Professor Voss looked toward the chapel. I believe, for whoever carried the talisman. A cool breeze stirred the trees. The woods seemed to beckon. Far away, beyond the river, Dorothea looked toward a sky she did not recognize. Closer to home, Youngblood gripped the empty pocket where the blue talisman had rested only hours before. And for the first time since the mystery began, the group realized they were no longer merely chasing answers. Someone else was chasing them.